the word of the Lord.
Our first reading for this Sunday comes from the Book of Wisdom. I would like to propose the following theme for our reflection this Sunday: remaining focused on God even when He is out of sight. How do we keep connected with God even if we don't see God? In the first reading, we find an account of the night when the first Passover was celebrated by the Jews. That night when they awaited their liberation from Egypt so that they could start this long journey to the land promised to them by God. It's very clear in the first reading that the Jews that night awaited the coming of the angel of the Lord. They were there as families, secure in their faith that that night something good will happen. And they even offered sacrifice according to the prescriptions of God, received, of course, through Moses. The skeptics among us might ask the Jews, well, how sure are you that that evening, that night, would really be your night of liberation? There have been so many nights where Moses talked with Pharaoh and Pharaoh refused to let you go. How sure are you that this particular night is really the fulfillment of all that Moses had instructed you to do and to wait for? Well, the response of the first reading is this: plainly, faith. The people Israel, true enough, they have not seen yet what God would do, but they believed in the God who promised. And even if their eyes are still waiting to see the fulfillment of God's word, in their hearts they remained connected with God. Their eyes have not yet seen, but their hearts were already resting in God, the God whose words are trustworthy, the God whose words are able to elicit from them belief. This is the whole point of our reflection this morning. Some people say, I will believe only if I see. And if I see clearly, then that will nurture my faith. But in the first reading, we see that you could be connected to God, and you could wait for God's coming. You could wait for God's intervention, relying on God, whose word is believable, whose word is credible. And so, when the event really happened, and the Israelites finally saw and experienced the Exodus, it was not the first time that they got connected with God. In their hearts, they were already linked with God in a relationship called faith. And the seeing came later. So, my dear brothers and sisters, faith is a form of seeing with the heart. And you will remain connected with God, seeing God all the time, waiting for Him to be manifested in your heart, even if the eyes do not yet literally see. This was the experience of the Jews that fateful night when they awaited the angel of God. And in their hearts, they knew it would happen. Their hearts rested in God.
of the Lord.
Our second reading for this Sunday comes from the letter to the Hebrews. We are reflecting on the theme of focusing on God even when God does not appear, or we do not see God. Remaining connected with God even when our sight fails. And in the first reading, we see the example of the Jews. They were awaiting God in this dark night when it was promised that the angel of death would pass, but will spare the Israelites. Their hearts saw God, even if their eyes were still waiting to see the fulfillment of the promise. And that is faith. Faith is the theme of the second reading. According to the letter to the Hebrews, faith is the substance of things that we hope for. Faith is the assurance concerning what we hope for. Faith is the conviction about things we do not see. So, here we find the contrast between what we see and what we believe. So people can be connected with God in faith even when our eyes do not see yet the physical fulfillment of what God has promised. In the second reading, we have the figure of Abraham presented to us. Abraham, who is called the father in faith. And also the figure of this great woman, the wife of Abraham, Sarah. Both these persons were promised by God. Grand promises, which any human being in his or her right mind will see right away as quite absurd or impossible. If I were Abraham, I would be tempted to say, Lord, thank you for your beautiful words, but I know I will not see the fulfillment of your words. Like having a child or having so many children. In fact, Sarah even laughed when she heard that promise. But look at what these two persons presented to us. Examples of faith. According to the letter to the Hebrews, Sarah especially thought that the one who had made the promise was worthy of trust. Even if the words seemed absurd, even if the eyes have not yet seen what is promised, the heart sees God and knows that God is worthy of my trust. So the heart remains connected with God, even if my eyes have not yet seen what I want to see. And as the second reading progresses, we are told that our fathers and mothers in faith really have not seen fully the fulfillment of the promises. Even Moses saw the promised land only from afar. Moses was not able to set foot on the promised land. They were not able to engage in physical seeing or experiencing. Yet, these people lived by faith. Faith in God. And even if they do not see what was promised, even if they are not able to set foot on the promised land, in their hearts, they are connected with God. Nothing, even the absence of sight, would prevent them from being linked with God in a relationship called faith. And so, they remained attentive to God in their hearts. They remained open to the action of God in their hearts. Their third eye, as it were, the eye of faith, was always open, waiting for God in the relationship called trust, called faith.
The Gospel of the Lord.
Our gospel passage for this Sunday comes from St. Luke. We have been reflecting on keeping ourselves focused on the Lord, even if we don't always see Him. So we're talking here about a different type of sight, connectedness with the Lord in what we call faith, even if the Lord is not always visible to our eyes. This is the message that we gathered in the first reading, where the Jews lived by faith. They were connected with God who promised them liberation, even if they have not yet seen the fulfillment of that promise. They were attentive to God, and they hoped that God will fulfill His word. And that's the same message in the second reading. In the letter to the Hebrews, we find Abraham, Sarah, remaining focused on God, even if, rationally speaking, they could not see the point of God's word. But the one who made the promise is worthy of trust. So their hearts were focused on God. And, wow, even if they did not see with their eyes the full fulfillment of the promises, they lived by faith. They never wavered. They were focused on God. In the gospel, we find Jesus talking about the attitudes of some servants the moment their masters leave and the masters are out of sight. I'm sure many of us could relate with this story. The moment our boss, our master, becomes invisible, physically absent, what happens to the servant? In the parable of Jesus, He says, some servants, the moment the master leaves to attend a wedding, and so will be away for a few days or even weeks, without telling the servant when he would be back, what is the possible effect on the servant? What will happen to the servant when the master is not seen anymore? And when the master does not see physically what the servant is doing? Now, Jesus says, some start acting like little bosses. The master is gone. Now I assume the role of being master. And this false master becomes abusive towards his co-workers. And this courage to be abusive is born out of the false idea that anyway, the master is absent. We don't see him, and he does not see us. Okay? And so, this false master takes his time, taking advantage, eating, drinking, abusing the other fellow workers. I remember, these are his fellow workers, but he is now in a pretentious mode. I pretend to be the master, and does not even consider that the master will return at a time that we do not expect. This is a foolish servant. He lost his connection with his master. The moment the master is physically absent, this servant is no longer focused on the master. His heart does not remain in the master. His heart forgets that there is a real master. He forgets that the master has orders, has plans that he must implement. When the master is out of sight, the master is also absent in the heart of the servant. Then the master returns. Imagine what will happen to that servant. Oh, we can imagine the servant rushing to do the work that has not been accomplished, rushing to hush up his fellow servants so that they would not report to the master. So the gospel is telling us, be vigilant. But how do we remain vigilant? The gospel is telling us, be prepared for the coming of the master, for we do not know the hour. But how do we remain prepared? Do not lose your connection with the master, even if the master seems to be absent. Do not cut your connection with the master, even if we do not see him. This is what we call faith. The faith that the second reading talks about. The faith that Abraham and Sarah exemplified. It was not always clear to their minds and to their eyes what the Lord was talking about, but their hearts were always focused on God. And so whenever the Lord comes and whenever the Lord fulfills His promise, they are ready. What the Lord commands, they will do, because they have not lost their connection with Him. The same attitude of the Jews in the first reading. They were prepared. They slaughtered the lamb. They were waiting in the dark. But in their hearts, they were connected with the God who promised to save them. And they were attentive. They were ready, so that when the angel passes, they will go. My dear brothers and sisters, what type of servants are we? Are we the servants who cuts our connection with the Lord and falls into the danger of, oh, anyway, the Lord does not see me? So we engage in things that are against His will, and we also become abusive, irresponsible, lazy, because the Master is not anymore in our hearts. This is the attitude that is equivalent to lack of faith. I know, my dear brothers and sisters, that there are instances in life when we do not see the Lord. In moments of anxieties, problems, it's so hard to see the Lord. But some people, at the height of success, at the height of joy, they also do not see the Lord. And so the connection in faith is cut. So, in times of problems and anxieties, some people just lose their faith. And some, at the height of success, become like this abusive servant. No more connection with the Master. And what a disaster. Whether we are at the height of joy and success or at the depths of suffering, let us not lose our connection with the Lord. Let us keep connected to Him in our hearts, even if we do not see His presence. He might come anytime. And who will see His coming and who will be prepared to welcome Him? Only those who remained connected with Him in their hearts. Faith. My dear brothers and sisters, I was able to visit a country, I won't mention which one, and I had the opportunity to interact with some of our overseas Filipino workers. And I met a person there who, as it were, rose from the ranks. His employer found in him a trustworthy employee. And so, to his surprise, this rich employer entrusted to him a whole villa, and told him, I am out of the country most of the time. This most precious possession of mine, a villa, no? You take care of this one. You will reside here. Now, look at this. Some of his friends tell him, hey, you practically own the villa. Why don't you use it? Entertain friends. Gather your fellow Filipinos. Throw parties there. Take advantage of your position. And this lowly man told me, Bishop, I'm tempted all the time to follow their suggestion, but one thing holds me back. My master, my employee, puts his trust in me, and that trust will always be in my heart. That binds me to him. I will never violate that trust. So even in his physical absence, my heart is always open to him. I will not do anything to ruin that trust. Good and faithful servant. That's what we should be to the Lord. The word has been exposed. Let us now fulfill it.